We can say it. History was made in Singapore. The first ever face-to-face encounter between a sitting U.S. president and a North Korean leader. It marks for many a de facto recognition of Pyongyang by Washington. More than a handshake, but far less than a roadmap to lasting peace on the peninsula. What will it take to denuclearize Korea? What do Koreans want? What do neighbors, China and Japan, want? What does Donald Trump want? And what prospects for the people in Pyongyang? Is it a first step towards the opening up of one of the world's most reclusive regimes? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at a handshake for the ages. With us from New York City is a former campaign advisor to Donald Trump, public affairs consultant Sam Nunberg joins us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's an honor.
From Wellesley, Massachusetts, Catherine Moon, Chair of Asian Studies at Wellesley College. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
Hello.
Benoit Kennedy chairs the France-Korea Friendship Association here in Paris, the author in French of Unknown North Korea. How are you?
Good evening.
And Antoine Bondas, senior lecturer at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po.
Good evening.
How are you doing?
Fine.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. They met, they shook hands, they had lunch, they signed pledges, and they promised a better tomorrow.
역사적인 이 만남에서 지난 과거를 덮고 새로운 출발을 알리는 그 역사적인 문건에 서명을 하게 됩니다.
Catherine Moon, for those of us who don't watch Korean affairs so closely, listening to the sound of Kim Jong-un's voice as he promises a brighter tomorrow, what were your thoughts on Kim? How did he seem to you?
Well, I had watched the Kim Moon summit as well, the one that took place on the Korean Peninsula in April. And on both occasions, I noticed that Kim Jong-un can speak quite eloquently in the Korean language with gravitas and very simple elegance. And he can be very effective. So I have to say that I was surprisingly impressed on both occasions. And he seemed very comfortable on both occasions and very willing to be part of the world for a guy who's just basically stepped out of his home very recently.
Yeah, because we still don't really know everything or about what is the power structure in Pyongyang. Is he the sole man in charge or not? It's so difficult to know.
But I do think he is the man in charge. There is never, even in a dictatorship, only one person running a country. And North Korea is a very complicated place with 25 million people and multiple interests that compete for political attention. So even Kim has to work with other elites. But I think Mr. Kim in North Korea has tremendous challenges. Number one, what to do with the military establishment that increasingly is getting sidelined as talks about denuclearization have been enhanced over the last few months, and also economic interests. There are people who already have gained greatly by trading illegally in the black market and condoned by the government. What are they going to continue to win or possibly lose if Kim takes the country into a different economic direction, which he has been signaling very clearly? These are important questions to consider.
Kim stepping out of North Korea into the limelight. And if you enjoyed Singapore, wait, because there's more to come.
Starting that process very quickly. Very, very quickly. Absolutely.
Personally invite your team to the White House.
Absolutely.
He goes on to say that they'll be meeting many times. Antoine Bondas, your thoughts on that?
It was actually an historic meeting. Was it an historic agreement? Clearly not. It's not even a technical agreement on denuclearization. It's not even close to the JCPOA that basically Donald Trump canceled over Iran. It's actually just a declaration of intent, very vague, when the denuclearization, the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is mentioned. There is no mention of the denuclearization that would be complete verifiable, and irreversible. This is basically the words we use in the resolution of the United Nations Security Council. So it's a very, very light declaration, yet it's a good opportunity actually to go in the right direction. The path is very long towards denuclearization, but at least we're heading in the right direction.
Heading in the right direction, Benoit Kennedy?
Yes, I'm not such a pessimist. Of course, it is not a very, it is a light declaration, but if we consider what was made in the Panmunjom declaration between the two Korean leaders, such a declaration was very powerful, not only about denuclearization of the whole peninsula, but also about a peace agreement. And there is also some details which are quite original. For example, militaries, American militaries who died during the Korean Wars, which will be repatriated to the United States. I think which is the most important, it is the beginning of a process. It will be a very long process. I agree with you, it will be very difficult to reach an agreement. But at least, for the first time, an incumbent US president and a North Korean leader decided to meet together. If we consider what happened only 9 months ago, when the United States and Donald Trump himself threatened to destroy the North Korean regime in the United Nations, we can imagine how huge a progress has been made for 9 months.
If I may, in the declaration, there is nothing new. The prisoner of wars and the missed in action, like the people who disappeared during the combats, were actually mentioned already in 2012 in the Kim Jong-un, Barack Obama declaration, the so-called Leap Day Deal agreement. There is clearly nothing new in that declaration, and everyone can compare it to the September 2005 agreement as part of the 6-party talk. There is nothing more in this one, and compare actually to previous agreement, this one is a very, very light one.
Sam Nunberg, you agree?
If I may...
I absolutely disagree with the panelists that just spoke. I think that, one, I know I'm speaking to a European audience, you have to take out your distaste for Donald Trump. He inherited an extremely difficult situation. He was told by Barack Obama that this was the #1 threat. Even as president-elect, he had told Kim Jong-un through tweets, you're never going to get a nuclear weapon. I know for a fact that he wanted war plans. He was very close to bombing Kim Jong-un. The fact of the matter is that Donald Trump has approached this in the new way. I think that the world has to get used to this. This is what Americans want. They want things to get done. And what we don't want is this academic point of view where you start comparing it to these past agreements. I mean, when I hear a panelist start talking about a 2005, a this, a that, those were consummate failures. And one of the reasons Donald Trump was elected is because we don't want to do business as usual as Americans. We don't want this academic international type of agreement process that doesn't get things done. The reason why they put out a letter like this is because Donald Trump understands con men and tyrants like this guy Kim Jong-un. And he wants to see this done in baby steps, and he wants gestures done by Kim Jong-un. Remember, he has not taken away those sanctions at all. He has gotten them already to denuclearize some site. He has had prisoners returned. And Kim Jong-un would not be sitting there today. He would not be sitting there with advisors who are 60, 70 years old that view Americans like me as dogs and wolves and they need to kill us if they weren't scared of him. And the President Trump is offering them something. What he is offering Kim Jong-un is he is saying to him, did you like MBS? Did you like MBS in Saudi Arabia? He said, it's time for you to make a decision. Do you want to adapt to the new world? You're not going to be able to keep your people as peasants who are not going to be able to understand the way the world works anymore. That's just not realistic. Look what happened in the Middle East. Or do you want to stay in power with your people happy? Because somebody like Kim Jong-un, he doesn't care if his people are happy or his people starve. What he cares about is that he's in power. And if he could trade the nuclear weapons for happier society, for a society that economically strives and to be part of the global world, the kid's 26, he'll take that deal. But Trump is not going to be the way President Bush was, the way President Obama was. You have to remember, Suzanne Rice, she said immediately, she said that we have to accept a nuclear Korea. We're never going to accept that. Trump won't do it. He'll bomb them.
Very briefly, Catherine Moon. very briefly, because we have to cross to James Andre. It's very late in the night for him in Singapore. Your reaction?
I would take issue with some of the comments made by the gentleman who just spoke because he contradicted some of Mr. Trump's very own words. Number one, Mr. Trump had said before he got to Singapore that this would be very new. Whatever deal he makes with Kim Jong-un would be like nothing that had ever happened before, and in reality, it is basically lower in expectations and standards than what had happened in the past agreements and negotiations. Number two, Mr. Trump is the one who set out to actually denuclearize North Korea very fast, lump sum, and only about 10 days ago, he started switching gear and saying that this will take time. So this notion of intentional baby steps by Mr. Trump laid out in Singapore, that is just misleading. That is not how Trump had envisioned it from the beginning.
All right,
the third point here is
we're going to pick up on more of this.
The third point here is that Mr. Trump actually gave away two things that are critical. Offering to stop military exercises with South Korea
military
without
exercises.
ever
Catherine Moon, I'm going to interrupt you on that
defense.
point. The military exercises, because I want to come back to that in full, because that's a very important point. Too early to talk about. There were many moments during this day, and it's too early to talk about personal chemistry between the 72-year-old Trump and the 30-something Kim. But there was this one moment that we want to show you when the press pool was coming in to take the pictures of the two leaders.
Very nice. Getting a good picture, everybody, so we look nice and handsome and thin.
Beautiful.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Please.
James Andre of France 24 is with us from Singapore. There we see a stone-faced Kim when Donald Trump talks about looking handsome and thin for the cameras.
Well, does resonate with a tweet that Donald Trump sent a few months ago now, in which he was basically stating the exact opposite. So obviously, Mr. Kim was slightly taken aback. But if you look at the whole day, this has been something reasonably constant. If you look at all the pictures, indeed, you could see Donald Trump, seasoned president of the United States now. He has been in power for over a year, used to meeting powerful people, used to these kind of venues, used to being around powerful people and being a leader, you know, a man who will put his hand on the shoulder of the person he's talking to. What was really quite remarkable was actually the normality, if you will, of Donald Trump's behavior during this whole meeting. He could have been with any other head of state. He would, had he been with Angela Merkel or Emmanuel Macron, he would have pretty much showed the same body language. The whole setting was also quite incredible to actually see these North Korean flags intertwined with US flags as they were shaking hands during that picture, which will quite clearly go down in history, that image of the both men coming from each side of that stage in front of those flags. That is something that the world will most certainly remember. But indeed, it was a very interesting, rather surreal moment. I was just in front of the Capella Hotel when this was taking place. The place had been completely bunkerized. There were hundreds of Singaporean policemen ensuring security around the island. So the traffic was actually stopped for most of the morning, and the hotel itself was, well, we tried to film it from various angles with my colleague the day before, extremely difficult to get an actual shot of. So maximum security, and on the same, in the meantime, this impression of Donald Trump wanting to show, wanting to give this image of being equal with Kim Jong-un, and that's exactly what Kim Jong-un wanted. That is what he got. As far as PR is concerned, he has gone from being the little rocket man to being a player on the international scene.
Player on the international scene. And James, when you think back to that reporting assignment for France 24, back in 2013 when you went to North Korea, what do you think they're making of it all in Pyongyang?
Well, it must be extremely surreal for them as well. Now, I've been told by experts on North Korea that all the anti-American propaganda has been taken down, which is rather difficult to believe in a sense, because if you go to the War Museum, the Korean War Museum in Pyongyang, that was full of anti-American propaganda. Back in 2013, when I went myself to Pyongyang, we had minders with us, obviously, and the minder, just to give you an example, was always referred to the United States saying, I quote, "The American bastards, the South Korean puppet soldiers, and the vassal states." That's the states that, of course, back the US. That was like this formula that everybody was using back then to talk about the states and talk about the West. Can you imagine the shift this is as far as image is concerned in Pyongyang? It's difficult to imagine, after being force-fed from birth, that America is the enemy, that they are monsters, etc., that now their leader is there on the international stage, all over television, talking hand in, face to face with Donald Trump.
And perhaps going to the White House soon. And we'll be talking about it more in part 2. Many thanks, James Andre, very late in Singapore, for being with us. We're going to be with the rest of our panel when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us on what's been a historic day with that Singapore summit between Donald Trump and North Korea's Kim Jong-un. With us talking about it is public affairs consultant Sam Nunberg in New York, a former campaign advisor to Donald Trump. From Wellesley, Massachusetts, Catherine Moon, who chairs the Asia Department at Wellesley University, here in the studio. Benoit Kennedy, chair of the French-Korea Friendship Association, and Antoine Bondaz, who lectures at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po. Catherine Moon mentioning before the break how North Korea has pledged to suspend a test site, while the President of the United States surprised some by announcing the suspension of future military exercises with North Korea, exercises which Trump admitted are provocative.
I want to get our soldiers out. I want to bring our soldiers back home. We have right now 32,000 soldiers in South Korea. And I'd like to be able to bring them back home. But that's not part of the equation right now. At some point, I hope it will be, but not right now. We will be stopping the war games, which will save us a tremendous amount of money, unless and until we see that the future negotiation is not going along like it should. But we'll be saving a tremendous amount of money. Plus, I think it's very provocative.
Very provocative. Are you surprised by those remarks, Antoine Bondaz?
I'm quite surprised. And to get back actually on the arguments that were used before, mostly on prejudices and not on facts, let's get things clear. Donald Trump is undoing what has been done before. He's weakening the alliance with South Korea, is mentioning the potential withdrawal of American troops from South Korea with no real reason. He's talking about war games. This is actually military exercises that are more than legal. They are justified and defensive in the framework of a bilateral alliance with the South Korean. And once again, Donald Trump is offering unilateral concessions to the North Koreans when the North Koreans so far have not been doing anything. Let's be clear.
Offering there is a concessions or hinting at concessions?
That's simply not true.
There is a freeze.
It's completely inaccurate what he said.
Thank you. There is a freeze on nuclear tests and ballistic missiles. It doesn't mean anything. This is reversible. There is a so-called dismantlement
Has he tested a missile?
of
When's the last time he's tested a missile?
There is a so-called dismantlement of Pyongyang. Test site is not dismantled at all. On the opposite, Kim Jong-un last year tested for the very first time long-range ballistic missiles, ICBM called Hwasong 14, Hwasong 15, and the level of threat to the United States is unprecedented, and this is something we got in July and November last year.
Sam Nunberg?
Well, first of all, part of the problem is that this mindset of criticizing the president, I don't mean that as a personal, is you have to remember, we as Americans, we have the defense commitment. Because I can tell you, if we go to war, first of all, we have abandoned South Korea. We have put in there a air defense system that the South Korean leader didn't even want in there, and Donald Trump was able to get it in there very, very early on. Those war games that everybody on this panel is criticizing him for suspending were the biggest war games that have ever been done in the history, I believe, or something. The one last December was one of the largest ever. They sent planes that they have never sent there before. And the fact of the matter is we're going to have to make goodwill gestures, because one thing that we Americans don't want is we don't want to have to send over 300,000 troops to Korea to have a war. We don't want it. And it's going to be us, once again, that have to do it. The majority of the legwork is usual. That is our position.
If I may step in, this is Catherine Moon. I have worked on, studied the U.S.-Korea alliance for the last 25, 30 years of my life. And this is a fact, the gentleman who just spoke, that the joint military exercises did get way too large, 300,000, et cetera, troops, mostly South Korean troops, not American troops. I repeat, mostly South Korean troops make up the 300,000
wasn't what I was saying. You're taking what I was saying out of context. What I was saying,
excuse me, if
what
I
I was
may
saying
continue,
is if we go to
if I may
Hold on, one at a
continue.
time. First, Catherine Moon. First, Catherine Moon.
We are not, and the fact is that we do not need, the U.S. does not need to have such a large presence during the joint military exercises, which definitely do serve to threaten the North Koreans. They complain about it chronically. And the large size is not necessary for training and accountability for preparedness. However, the fact is that Mr. Trump said these words about the military exercises without having gotten consultation or agreement from the U.S. Defense Department and the South Korean government. Both the U.S. Pentagon and the South Korean Ministry of Defense immediately responded with, that is not in our playbook, and no one has told us that we are going to stop the exercises. Even the U.S. military command in South Korea responded that they are proceeding as planned for the August military exercises, and that there is no command from the military brass to stop such exercises. So this was not a planned idea that Mr. Trump put forth. My attitude toward the whole summit was do no harm. And in some ways, harm has been done by broaching this topic about military exercises.
Sam Nunberg?
He hasn't lifted any sanctions. Sanctions or besides the military exercises, or what got Kim Jong-un to the table, along with the fact that Donald Trump, President Trump, threatened Kim Jong-un back, which is something that we haven't done, past presidents haven't done. And the larger point is if the Defense Department didn't hear about this, well, they heard about it now from the Commander-in-Chief. And if the Commander-in-Chief believes that they need to be reinstituted, everybody wants to say, you guys are picking apart. You're leaving out what Trump said. If the deal goes well, if they continue to make steps, and I'm sure the North Koreans are going to have to make steps before August, then he will suspend them. He will suspend them, and we'll continue to get
I agree with you
carrots.
that one of the problems of the joint statement is that it is not legally binding. It is basically an aspirational statement, which is fine. It is much better than being on a war footing, as we would all agree. However, I would disagree with you about sanctions. Mr. Trump unwittingly, unknowingly, unintentionally, I'm sure, slipped by going off script and saying that it was okay for China to have gone lax in terms of sanctions enforcement on the border with North Korea. He said it himself, and that actually is highly problematic because he has basically given the green light for the world to not take U.S. unilateral sanctions and multilateral sanctions from the UN Security Council seriously. But North Korea, I'm sure, is very, very thrilled.
But Benoit Kennedy,
I agree with you.
Benoit Kennedy,
by the way, I agree with you, ma'am.
But Benoit Kennedy, let me ask you, how dangerous is it when you're dealing with the Korean Peninsula to go off script in a situation like today?
We have to be very clear. What has been said that so far what has been tried with North Korea didn't work. I'm sorry to say it, but what Mr. Obama did was just a disaster because North Korea went on getting a nuclear device, North Korea getting on having his own test missiles. At least what Mr. Trump tried on the successes, had a success on that point, is that so far they are discussing to each other. Another point which is very important, it is the opinion of the Korean, not only the North Koreans, but also the South Koreans. We have to know that I do not agree with the fact that the American-South Korean alliance would be weakened. It is absolutely not like that. Mr. President Moon Jae-in wants to improve the inter-Korean relations. So it means that the war games the military exercises, which are the biggest in the world, are a big threat to improving North-South relations. My opinion on President Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president, told it is a huge success because for the first time, the Americans and the South Koreans can work together. The alliance was not weakened at all, but it is the beginning of a process which will also help to improve inter-Korean relations and, I hope, a peaceful unification of Korea.
First, I'm not sure the Japanese will think the same, and I don't remember any time President Moon asking for the suspension. There is a difference between reducing the scale of military exercises, and we all agree on that, and suspending them. That actually dual freeze was a demand from China and from Russia since 2016, so-called dual freeze, a freeze of the testing against a freeze of the military exercises. I'm sure that Beijing today is very thrilled with what's happening. That's a very good thing for China. That's a very good thing for North Korea. But once again, I think that in the long term, it may threaten and actually not threaten, but weaken.
Let's listen on that point. Let's listen on that point to the Japanese Prime Minister after meeting last week in Washington with Trump ahead of the G7 summit and speaking again with him Monday on the telephone. Shinzo Abe seemed to have a sober take on what happened in Singapore.
I welcome the fact that we obtained a written confirmation of leader Kim Jong-un's will to commit to complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. Regarding the abduction issue, I made up my mind that Japan needs to face North Korea directly and resolve it between two countries.
Japan needs to face North Korea directly. Catherine Moon, do you have the impression that Shinzo Abe is saying that, well, he's all by himself now on this one?
Yeah, and I feel bad for Mr. Abe because he should have picked up the cues much earlier. He has been riding on wishing that he could ride on the coattails of Mr. Trump and that Mr. Trump might deliver some things on behalf of the Japanese people. And that just is not true. I think, I know, Japan and North Korea have already begun to consider a possible summit between Kim and Abe. And I am positive, I'm not a predicting type, but I'm positive that they too will have a summit because Mr. Kim Jong-un of North Korea is on a diplomatic rollout. He is in high gear. He has met with President Moon of South Korea, President Xi of China, Putin of Russia, and of course he will meet with Abe, especially since he's met with Trump. So I think Mr. Abe's right. He's on his own, and that is basically a confession that having allied himself with Mr. Trump is not going to work on Japan's behalf.
All right, we've been talking about the security concerns. There was this moment today where Donald Trump, during that long press conference, boasted he'd given Kim a taste of what North Korea could be. He showed him a 4-minute video clip on his iPad. That clip was again shown just before the press conference to the journalists gathered in the press center. Here's an excerpt.
Will this leader choose to advance his country and be part of a new world? Be the hero of his people? Will he shake the hand of peace and enjoy prosperity like he has never seen a great life or more isolation? Featuring President Donald Trump and Chairman Kim Jong-un in a meeting to remake history.
Yeah, the same. I guess there was also a version in Korean with this the same, probably the same booming voiceover. Will that work with the Koreans? He also talked about developing the beaches in North Korea. Donald Trump, the former real estate developer that he is. How do you think North Koreans react to that kind of video?
To such an announcement? I think that the North Koreans, since Kim Jong-un took power, had been used with the changing of the atmosphere. We have to remember, for example, the images of Walt Disney series in 2012. The North Korean society is evolving. we have to know that North Korea is not a static country. And what also probably has some influence in understanding the change of position of North Korea, because they decided to discuss with the United States quite easily. It is because the society is not static, and what is most important is North Korea is economic booming. Of course, it is a little boom because there is the sanctions. And what is the most important for North Korea is levering the sanctions. They do not want sanctions anymore. Today, sanctions are a big problem for developing the country. And what North Koreans are looking for, it is probably that sanctions could be not last would not last anymore. And it is also very important that China is probably backing North Korea on that position.
Yeah, China is backing North Korea on that position, calling for an easing of sanctions. San Munderg, what does your crystal ball tell you? Do you see a North Korea that opens up to the outside world and becomes more like a liberal democracy, or that becomes, well, more like China, where you have capitalism and an authoritarian state?
Well, I think that President Trump has essentially offered Kim Jong-un to become China. And I think that what look, I've had discussions with him a long time about issues like this, and during those years in the lead up to his presidency, or his presidential run, rather. And an interesting point nobody recognized was in the second presidential GOP debate, this was the issue that President Trump, then candidate Trump, mentioned was Kim Jong-un, was the nuclear issue there. He has a long history of approaching this through his uncle, who was a lecturer at MIT, and used to talk to him about nuclear weapons. And I think that along with his idea that he's talked about since the 80s in the Art of the Deal book about the approach of dealing with adversaries in negotiations, essentially, and if you read the letters he has sent, and he's certainly dictated those letters, he's saying, I'm giving you two choices here. First choice is I take out your nuke program and I take you out. And I believe that the president was very close to an initial bombing of at least one site. Or we ease these sanctions. You see I'm getting cooperation internationally. And you continue to rule the country, but you don't have to worry about having a country where you're going to have to starve your people to stay in power. You can have a country where you keep your people happy and you stay in power. And that's the deal he wants. The president is also somebody who's extremely he doesn't want a full-scale war. I don't think the president has a problem with confrontation. I don't think he has a problem with the initial bombings. But his problem is eventually, he wouldn't have a problem taking that action. What I'm trying to say, let me clarify, he doesn't want to have to stay in there forever. And I think that was, yes.
Let me just bring in some of the other panelists because we're running short on time on this. Antoine Bondaz, Donald Trump, is that what you saw today, that he was offering North Korea a path down the Chinese model?
I'm not quite sure. First, I'm very glad that Sam is actually quoting someone from the MIT and an academic. Then I will, if we compare North Korea with China, why not? Perfect. China normalized relations with the US. China benefited a lot from US investment while keeping nuclear weapons and while being a nuclear weapon state. Third, as long as you have economic sanctions on North Korea, and as long as the nature of the DPRK regime is not evolving, it will be very, very difficult for the North economy to really reform. You may have, and you do have actually, for the last few years, some economic new kind of management. Do you have a boom? Yes, in Pyongyang, that's true. Will it be sufficient in the long term? We do not know yet. And the key question today is how can the DPRK manage actually the dilemma between improving people's livelihood while keeping a tight control on the population?
Catherine Moon, how would South Koreans feel about North Korea going down the Chinese path?
Well, I think any path that takes North Korea off a nuclear path would be welcome, at least for some period of time. But I don't think we should assume, as people often do, that the North Koreans are so eager to go down China's path or to take the, quote, Chinese model. For one, the North Koreans are very savvy, incredibly proud. They have never wanted to succumb to a great power, including China, formerly Soviet Union, and the United States. So what the North Koreans will do, I am sure, is try to buy themselves as much independence as possible, as much autonomy as possible, playing the different great powers off one another and different potential economic supporters like South Korea off others. And that is what any smart leader in any sovereign state should do, I suppose. But I don't think we should bank on North Koreans kowtowing to the Chinese or kowtowing to anyone. I think Singapore, and Kim Jong-un said this while he was in Singapore, that he said this in Korean, that the North Korean people have much to learn from Singaporeans, that Singapore is a beautiful country, that people live well, and that there is much to be gained by learning from them. So perhaps it will be a Singapore model.
And what do you think South Koreans will remember from today, Catherine Moon?
I think the South Koreans are probably relieved that the summit went off without any real glitch. I know for a fact, having been reading the South Korean press, that there are many South Koreans, especially conservatives, who are quite alarmed by Mr. Trump's statement about the suspension of joint military exercises. So that is going to be playing a role in the general elections, which is taking place in South Korea basically any moment. So it has a big impact on South Korea, but I think for the time being, they will see basically what unravels or what develops.
Antoine Bondaz, what's the moment you'll take away from today?
Oh, I actually first fully agree with Catherine. I think, once again, we are heading in the right direction. There is a diplomatic solution in place, not a military solution, and that's indeed a very good thing. Is it enough? Clearly not, but that's another question. What we will wait for now is further negotiation between the US and the DPRK.
All right, we're running short on time. I want to thank you so much, Antoine Bondaz. I want to thank Sam Nunberg in New York, Catherine Moon in Wellesley, Massachusetts, Benoit Kennedy. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
What did you think of that promotional video for capitalism?
I think a lot of people found it strange, varying degrees of strange. But even let's just take a look at some of the headlines reacting to that. Mediaites here calling it a creepy propaganda video made for Kim Jong-un. Meanwhile, thinkprogress.org. For their part, it was a bizarre Hollywood-style trailer. So I think everybody found the style of it and the sort of Hollywood voiceover.
Wish you'd done the voiceover.
Right? Well, it would be quite historic. So there you go. I mean, people found it extraordinary, weird, bizarre, whatever. But I suppose it got a lot of attention. Now, I think that the whole build-up to this summit as well, certainly how it was playing out on rolling news channels, was also very dramatic. We were seeing kind of Hollywood-style music on various American networks as well. The build-up to it, the suspense factor, which some people found maybe a little bit overdone. There again, I suppose the content of that video and the real estate perspective, but many referring to that. Trump applauding North Korea's great beaches, both Miami, I think images of Miami in that video as well, and condos and all of that. But in any case, some pointing to the typical Trumpian sort of reality TV show quality, both
Barack
in a very
former campaign man.
Right, there you go. So it was all very meta. You had the kind of reality TV show quality to the video itself, and I suppose to the coverage and the suspense created by Trump's
it had
communications.
us in suspense.
It certainly did. So there was that. Then I suppose that famous word bromance that keeps seeming to come back for Donald Trump in various relationships that he has with other heads of state. Now it's Kim Jong-un who is being referred to as the centre of that particular, the bromance of the century. We remember not so long ago that term was being used for Emmanuel Macron. This is a headline from yesterday's Financial Times about that particular bromance cooling down. Francois, we'll get to some cartoons later also that refer to all of that. Remember, of course, this was just hot on the heels of the G7 summit that left many wondering if Western alliances since the end of the Second World War were now not completely in tatters. Strategic move, Angela Merkel announces a new look, hoping to be taken more seriously by President Trump. So this was sort of the quality of some of the comment on social media. Now, Rodney,
Dennis
Rodney made an appearance as well in a lot of various comments, some even wondering if he might not be a shoe-in for ambassador. He did cry, it appears, on live television in Singapore, obviously quite moved. Well, somebody who does know both men personally, so perhaps it's going to move him more than most. Quick look then at some of the comments regarding, I suppose, just how people felt this deal went. Josh Rogan of the Washington Post saying the more Trump talks about the deal, the worse it sounds. US stops exercises, pledges to remove troops, no new sanctions, all in exchange for vague promises of denuclearization. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have commentators such as Piers Morgan, typically pro-Trump in his comments. Trump's critics are racing to dismiss his summit as a failure, but he's closer to peace with North Korea than any of his predecessors in the world. He feels safer tonight as a result. This kind of somewhere in the middle, Brookings Institute India, Dhruva Jaishankar saying greetings to all 5 people on Twitter who appreciate that the Trump-Kim summit is neither a debacle nor a sign of imminent world peace. In other words, probably somewhere in the middle.
Right.
Some mentioning the possibility of a Nobel Prize. Indeed, there were even cartoons alluding to that as well. I suppose we're a little bit far off all of that yet. And just finishing with a couple of cartoons as well. It was pretty rich in terms of material for cartoons. A lot of cartoons alluding to the absence of human rights discussions in this particular summit. I suppose it's one of the major criticisms that has been made of it. Others saying, well, perhaps it had to be put aside to move forward on certain aspects of the debate. This is Jacques Brel reimagined Ne me quitte pas, probably one of the better known chansons françaises, Ne me tweete plus. No more, I suppose, aggressive tweeting. So I suppose the réchauffement there between the two leaders. And a lot of cartoons really made reference to the kind of to the contrast between the G7 summit, which left, as you can see here in that image, Western relations between Western powers somewhat shakier than before. The King Kong of diplomacy arriving in Singapore. And I'll just finish with, if I can find it here, this particular image. Kim, it's so romantic being here with a kindred spirit watching the sunset on the Western Alliance.
Oh, dear.
That was the Washington Post as well.
That was Tolles in the Washington Post. Many thanks for that.
Mightn't be quite so grim in reality.
James Green. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.